Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on this Facebook Live. I am Dominique Pichard, and I'm the Chief Science Officer of RettSyndrome.org, which has been known as the International Rett Syndrome Foundation. I'm thrilled to connect with you today, so thank you so much for joining and for listening in. As you can see on the chat section, we have moderators that are helping. Please tell us where you're from and what brings you here today. Also, as I go through, I'm going to be answering questions at the end. So if there's anything that you have questions on, please post them in the comment or chat section, and I will get to them at the end. If I don't get to your question for some reason, please know that we'll get back to you offline, okay? So once again, thank you so much for being here on this Facebook Live. I'm Dominique Pichard, and I'm the Chief Science Officer of RettSyndrome.org. I spent the last several years of my career working in clinical research and trials in rare diseases at the National Institutes of Health, or NIH. And I was thrilled to have the opportunity to lead the research agenda at RettSyndrome.org. While I am a physician and scientist by training, like many of you that are listening in, I'm also the parent of a young woman with Rett syndrome. In this job as Chief Science Officer, I'm able to bring my professional background to a very personal level, and it is with this passion that I work hard to move us forward in our goal of treatments. The last few months have really marked a challenging time, in particular for those of us that have a loved one with Rett syndrome. We recognize the new set of challenges that the quarantine has brought to our families, and at RettSyndrome.org, we jumped right in with programming to provide caretakers with something to do at home while therapies were canceled. We didn't want our loved ones with Rett syndrome to lose out on all those important milestones that are gained through therapies, to maintain what it is that they have, to continue working on new skills. And that's why we've brought a variety of different therapies through these Facebook Lives. If you missed out on them, please look back on our Facebook page so that you can find some great things that you can continue to work on now that we are heading into our summer months. And really, this is at the core of RettSyndrome.org. We meet families where they are on their journey with Rett syndrome while working hard for a better tomorrow. So in light of the coronavirus pandemic, the forced changes in all of our daily lives, the fact that we are now forced to be full-time caretakers if we maybe had not been, if our kids were at school or in day programs, we may also be working from home at the same time. We may be essential workers and having to go into work and figure out how to do childcare when our kids are no longer in our schools or day programs. So we decided to change this from the Rett Ed seminar to a Facebook Live, making it a shorter little glimpse at what it is that we're doing on the research front. So with that, let's jump right in. So you may have seen the announcement about our newly formed Scientific Advisory Board. I am so excited to have these 12 accomplished thought leaders as advisors. Their expertise really ranges from the lab to drug development to clinic. We're going to have a link in the comments for where you can read the announcement about the Scientific Advisory Board in case you missed it, and see who these members are and a little bit about them. And when I selected these advisory board members, I really wanted to have the breadth of areas that are impacted by Rett syndrome. So in the lab, what areas are that we need to understand, further improve, move forward the research. But it's also important to get people that are outside of the field of Rett syndrome, bring in new thoughts and people that think about the same problems in a different way. So you'll see that the advisory board is made up of many names that you know in Rett syndrome, as well as some new names that will bring new thoughts to us. So this group of scientists is working with me right now to develop a 5-year strategic plan for our investments in science. And really, this is a crucial area to have the strategy planned out to make sure that all of the dollars that are raised by each of you have the most impact. There's always more work that needs to be done than can be funded by any single organization, which is why we're mapping out the research that we feel needs to be undertaken and planning how to be most impactful to get treatments for our loved ones with Rett syndrome. One way we invest in research is through our grant program. We have a very well-established system to carefully vet the applications. So this is what we call a peer review process. And so what does this mean? We get applications from researchers. We then send those applications out to scientists that have an expertise in the particular area of that research, and we have them give us a critical review. We then meet in person, or if this were during the time of pandemic, we would meet virtually and have all of these scientists with expertise in the different areas review all of the proposals. This really ensures that the science that is being proposed and that we ultimately fund is robust. So we've received many applications, and we're very enthusiastic about the research that we've committed to funding. For you to get to know these researchers, the work that they are doing, and the passion that drives them, we're restarting the series called In the Lab. This is going to be a series that you're going to be able to see online. And again, we're going to post the link in the comments so that you can see the most recent one that was just posted. This really will be your best way to learn about the research that we are funding, that all of that funding comes from the fundraising you do. So on May 29th, we posted our first In the Lab series. This was highlighting Dr. Davut Pelivan. He is in his training, so he received what's called a Mentor Training Award. He's at Baylor College of Medicine, and he's working under the mentorship of the experts at Baylor, which include Dr. Huda Zogby, Dr. Dan Glaze, Dr. Ben Suter. So please go and read about Dr. Pelivan's work and keep an eye posted. We'll be posting about 1 to 2 new In the Lab series a month so that you can see the research that we are funding. And really the ultimate goal of the research that we fund is to find treatments for those of our loved ones that are living with Rett syndrome today, to identify the best neurohab programs so that our family members with Rett syndrome are physically and neurologically in the best condition they can be and be ready for these treatments when they are available. And thirdly, to ensure that the infrastructure and the tools necessary to have the clinical trials is in place. So speaking of clinical trials, you may be familiar with something called the SCOUT program, which is now named the Stephen G. Kaminsky SCOUT program in honor of my predecessor, Stephen Kaminsky. He built this program 7 years ago when he saw a lack of clinical trials for Rett syndrome as an area of significant need. At that time, there were no industry investments to bring drugs to clinical trials, which means no ability to have FDA-approved drugs for Rett syndrome. And really, the SCOUT program was created as a way for rettsyndrome.org to accelerate the process of getting drugs to clinical trials. And what you may or may not be familiar with is that to get the drugs to trial, you have to do quite a bit of testing before you get to a clinical trial. So this means testing in a lab, testing in an animal model, and then going to the FDA in the US, which is our regulatory agency, to get their approval for a clinical trial. And the FDA really wants to understand that you have looked at the safety of this drug in animal models. If it's a drug that's used for other conditions in humans, that you've looked at what those risks are and thought about how that may impact an individual with Rett syndrome, as well as to demonstrate that there is some benefit of this drug in the animal models that you are using. And so the SCOUT program is a way that rettsyndrome.org helps to facilitate that preclinical testing, so that animal model testing. And we use a Rett syndrome mouse model for this. So this is an important part of that drug development process, and really many small biopharmaceutical companies don't have the ability to do this on their own. They may not have the facilities, they may not have the expertise with the Rett syndrome mouse model, they may not have the funding to do this. And if we want pharma to invest in Rett syndrome, we need to help to bridge that gap. So 7 years ago, we partnered with a contract research organization that has the facilities to carry out the testing in a systematic and standardized manner. This means that we can compare the results between drugs as well, because each test is done the same way by the same hands, which is actually quite important when you're talking about mouse model testing. And then importantly, this contract research organization also has the expertise to work with the Rett syndrome mouse model that is used and with the behavioral tests that are carried out in the mice to test if the drugs have an impact. So we continue to see the value in advancing the drug development program in this way. So this is a program that we are continuing to invest in and currently have compounds that are being tested right now. So this brings me to actual clinical trials. In the US, you may be aware that there are 5 active clinical trials going on testing medications in those with Rett syndrome. Clinical trials really are a step in the process of getting medications for Rett syndrome. And they're a test to understand 2 things. One, you have to understand the safety of the medication, specifically in that population, so in those with Rett syndrome. While it may be a drug that's been tested in other disorders, other neurodevelopmental disorders, other neurologic disorders, it may be different. Someone with Rett syndrome may respond differently because of the changes that happen from the MECP2 mutation. So we need to understand the safety, and that's what a clinical trial does. And then ultimately, we need to know, does this drug work? Does it have efficacy in humans with Rett syndrome? To get to the point of a clinical trial, the company would have demonstrated that there was efficacy in a mouse model or in another animal model, but we all know mice aren't humans. So we really need to know, does that translate to actually showing improvement in a human with Rett syndrome? But because these clinical trials are to test the safety and efficacy of drugs, we have to remember that these clinical trials really can be quite regimented and require certain visits to identify if there's any side effects and also to be able to assess any potential changes while being on the drugs. So what does this mean? When there's a pandemic resulting in widespread disruption to our daily lives and to the healthcare system, clinical trials are also impacted. And what we've learned over the last couple of months is that really the risks of coronavirus to any one individual also relates to the area that you live in. How high are the numbers and how high is your exposure to coronavirus? So really each research site has had to follow the rules of their own hospital. This means that when clinical trials seem to get back to their normal level, it won't be at the same pace across the country. There will be some sites that are opening for research participants before other sites. And we just have to know that this is because of the health and the safety of everyone involved in research visits is of utmost importance, and that's the decision that the hospitals are making. So these aren't decisions that the pharmaceutical companies are making, telling when sites can open. These really are decisions that a hospital and the clinic is making for those trials. But this may also mean that as a family, you may not feel comfortable participating in a clinical trial right now, depending on where you live, depending on the risks that your own child with Rett syndrome carries. You may not feel like this is the right time for a clinical trial. And that's okay. These clinical trials are ongoing, and as you gain comfort, you can always reach back out to those clinic sites to see if they are still enrolling for a clinical trial that you might be interested in. Overall, the Rett syndrome clinical trials were able to continue for those study participants who were already receiving the drug. This means they were already enrolled, they had already had their baseline safety visits, and they were already receiving the study drug. But for enrolling new participants, that really universally went on hold. And that is because of the inherent risks of going to the hospital to have those visits, balanced against the benefit of these trial drugs. So one notable exception to this was the Anavex trial, which they have both telehealth and home nursing visits built into their protocol. And that was designed from the very start. And so this resulted in a smooth transition for them to be able to continue those visits in a remote manner or with home nursing. And I just want to highlight that this opportune trial design really stemmed from rettsyndrome.org's commitment to helping the guide industry to develop more patient-centered trials. Rettsyndrome.org had facilitated a parent roundtable with Anavex as really an advisory meeting so that the company could hear directly from families about what are the challenges associated with participating in a clinical trial when your family has Rett syndrome. What makes it easier? What makes it really hard? And therefore, they designed their clinical trial with that information in mind. So given what I said earlier, with each site following the rules of their hospital, if you are interested in participating in a clinical trial, please reach out to your your nearest study site or to your Rett syndrome clinic to learn where you can, which Rett syndrome clinics are sites for the clinical trial. They will be the ones that will be able to tell you when they can see research patients. Also be aware that when a clinic is open for clinical care, so let's say your Rett syndrome clinic is allowed to see you for your regular clinic visit, that's not the same as a research visit. So participating in a research visit may, in most instances, will likely start after clinical care is up and running. So please be patient with the sites. They want to see you as much as you want to get in, if that's the place that you are right now. And also, I just want you to know that this summer, I want you to stay tuned. We will be rolling out a resource that will help you to learn about what the different clinical trial opportunities are. So keep an eye out for that later this summer. And I want to end with the impact of COVID-19 on the research. So there were shutdowns worldwide, and our researchers really are worldwide. And our researchers, whether they're in the lab or the clinic, they were all impacted by this pandemic. Lab staff were not allowed to continue their lab experiments at the same rate, or in most instances at all. And clinic researchers could not see their research participants to continue their research. Much like the clinical trials, though, the reopening is very site-specific. So I'm in constant contact with our funded researchers, learning how their work was impacted, when they'll be able to get back to work, and what this means for the work that we have funded. I'm happy to report that we are seeing a return to work, albeit at lower levels than full-time. But this is really an exciting advancement that researchers are able to get back to the work that they really want to pursue and that we're excited to learn about. I also heard from many researchers that they took advantage of this time. It was a very drastic change in their day-to-day life where they might not be busy running experiments all day, and it gave them an opportunity to look for, to do data analysis, but also to think, to collaborate, to read. So I think ultimately we will hopefully see that there's new thoughts that come out from this time on the research that's being done and future research to be proposed. And on that note, I want to remind you that you are at the heart of the mission of rettsyndrome.org. We're intimately aware of the challenges with daily life with Rett syndrome. We know those challenges don't go on vacation. We know those challenges don't take a holiday. And we certainly know that those challenges don't get easier during a pandemic when all of our regular life is disrupted. So we don't stop in our work. We adapt and we keep forging ahead. And I'm going to take an opportunity to share with you a photo. Oh, it actually won't let me. Oh, here we go. So this is my daughter, my 13-year-old daughter with Rett syndrome. And this weekend, she herself did the 5K. We had a Rett Racers virtual summer 5K. It was an awesome opportunity. We had over 130 participants throughout the US. We had participants in Hawaii. I believe we even had a participant in Iceland that did this 5K. Together, as a group, we raised almost $70,000. But this was a really cool opportunity where my daughter, who has Rett syndrome, worked really hard during the quarantine to build up her endurance, and she herself walked for an hour and 1 minute to complete this 5K on her own. So I just wanted to share that to remind you, at my core, I am a parent of a child with Rett syndrome. I know the urgency we have, and I am passionate about working as hard as I can to really advance the science so that one day we can all celebrate having treatments for Rett syndrome. So with that, I want to remind you that we are going to continue our Rett Ed series next month in July, on July 15th. We're going to hear from Dr. Alan Percy, and he's going to be talking about longevity in Rett syndrome. So thank you all for listening in, for checking this out. I hope if you missed parts of it that you can go back and watch it. I am now going to go to the chat feature and see if there's questions that we can take. And again, if I don't get to all of your questions, please know that we will get back to you. So the first question is, do the medications work for the Rett variants too? So as we know, there's no FDA approved medication for Rett syndrome. So everything is still in this testing period, these clinical trials. The clinical trials, as I mentioned, they have to be somewhat, they are regimented and somewhat prescripted. What they want is to get a population that is as uniform as possible to be able to demonstrate that there's benefit. And so right now, the clinical trials are for those that have Rett syndrome. Would these work for Rett variants? So other MECP2 related disorders? We have to say time will tell. We have to do the work. We have to know which actual drug it is and what mechanism it's working on, and is it the same for some of these Rett-related disorders? So next question, can you comment on anything with regards to the Anavex 273 trial? So we are the patient advocacy organization. This is a trial that's sponsored by the pharmaceutical company. And what happens with clinical trials is you don't actually look at the data until the end, unless you had some sort of interim data analysis planned in the middle of it for some reason. And so that means that we don't know on the global level if this has been beneficial or not. You might hear individuals that are enrolled in the clinical trial comment on their experience, but we know that that is just one individual, and it really needs to be completion of the trial before the data can be looked at and analyzed to really comment on if there is a benefit from this. We have heard from the Anavex team that they are close to completing their enrollment. This means that they have filled almost all of the slots they have available for this trial. Then all those that are enrolled need to complete the trial. Once they've completed the trial, then that data analysis can begin. So next question, is there an NDA associated with the Anavex trial? So an NDA is a new drug application, and I'm going to defer to Anavex to answer that. I don't want to misrepresent. Anavex is the sponsor of the trial, so I don't want to misrepresent what they have done so far. So another question, and this is a really great question and really important to talk about. So my Rett daughter is 42. Will she ever benefit from the research? We hope yes. The reason that we hope that even your daughter at 42 years of age will benefit from the research is because we've had the proof of principle study that many people call the reversal study done in Adrian Bird's lab that really showed that those mice that had the mouse version of Rett syndrome, so full-blown symptoms from the loss of MECP2, when they got that gene back, they were actually able to recover many of what had been lost. So what does this mean? This means that even very late, at a point that researchers thought it wouldn't be there, the symptoms would not reverse, they would not be recoverable. Even at that late phase, the mice did have a reversal. So now that was what we call a proof of principle study. That was not a drug that did that. That was not a gene therapy that did it. That was a lab technique where you can turn that gene on and off. So that is just to say, the one example that we have to demonstrate that even older animals can recoup some of the skills that were lost or to benefit, that was shown. And so we are hopeful that this research and that these clinical trials will show that there is benefit even in someone that's 42. And as you've seen in the trofinetide, there was adults were enrolled in that trofinetide trial that did move on to a phase 3 clinical trial. And so we do hope that there will be benefit regardless of age. Another question is, can you provide updates on how the clinical trials are going? So I will briefly touch on them. So the Anavex, as I mentioned, they are close to finishing their enrollment, which means, I already mentioned, each clinical trial has a certain number of participants that they need to enroll, and they are almost to that number. So they will be completing their enrollment in the near future. Trofinetide, which is a phase 3 trial, is still currently enrolling. GW Pharmaceuticals has a clinical trial, also still in their enrollment phase. They are earlier in their enrollment phase. Some of their study sites have not yet actually opened, and this is because each clinical trial site has to go through an approval process in their own research facility. And so they need approval from their facility to be able to conduct the research. So while one site might be open, the other site might not yet be open. But GW is recruiting as well. There is a ketamine trial. They are also still continuing to enroll participants. And there is a trial with triheptanoin, which is in Georgia. It's a single site trial, so you have to go to that one site. It's not offered at multiple centers, and that is continuing to enroll as well. And then another question, is the trofinetide trial close to complete enrollment? No, they are not yet close to completion. So there's still plenty of opportunities to participate in that research if that is something that is of interest. Another question is, are there drugs being tried for younger Rett patients? My granddaughter is 3 years old. So this is another fantastic question, and there's always questions at the age spectrums. People want to know, will there be a benefit in my older loved one, and can my younger individual participate in clinical trials? As of right now, the clinical trials that are available are not enrolling very young children. And there's several reasons for this. We have to understand a clinical trial is meant to, I've already mentioned this, test the safety, but also the efficacy of the drug being tested. And at a young age, we may not know if that particular individual has plateaued, if they're continuing to regress. So if you're in a clinical trial and you're still regressing, losing skills, and that is what gets documented in the clinical trial, then the question is always, was this just part of Rett syndrome? Was this a regression that was going to happen? Did the medicine somehow impact the development of this young child? So that may be part of why younger individuals are not enrolled, as well as the fact that safety is really the key guiding factor for clinical trials. And young children are often not included for safety reasons. because of the testing that's being done in those that have to participate in studies. Almost all clinical trials will require you to get blood draws. There might be other invasive tests or even non-invasive tests that has to be done as part of your clinical trial participation. Another question, do you know when Efficacy is starting recruitment? So I've been in touch with the Efficacy, and they are still saying that they will make an announcement in the middle of 2020 about if they're going to move forward with their Rett research program, and if so, what the timelines would be. So we do not yet have any updates, but do know that I am in touch with them, and I am working hard to continue to represent our families. When I talk to all of these pharmaceutical companies, I always do it with the eye of our community. Efficacy knows that the families are anxiously awaiting more news. And as soon as they have that news to share, they will share that with the community. And there's another question on, are patients and families allowed to speak on potential efficacy during the trial? So that is a challenging question. So are they allowed to? Yes. Is it in the best interest of the research? Some would argue no. And why is this? Why is it that sometimes we hear that they don't want you to share your experience? These are, again, we're testing these drugs or medications. We don't know yet if they work, and if so, what benefit we're going to see. And if you are going into a clinical trial biased because you've heard, oh, drug XYZ resulted in this in another study participant, then you might be looking for that. And if your child or young adult, loved one does not achieve that, you may overlook some of the benefits that your loved one did have, or your child may actually be on the placebo. But when you're in a clinical trial, there's something called the placebo effect. And this really means that when you're enrolled in a clinical trial, you know that your child is taking something. They might be getting the real medication. They might be getting the control, which is a placebo, which means it doesn't have any active medication in it. Just by the mere fact of being in a clinical trial and having these visits with your trial site seems to create a perception of improvement. And this is not only from a caregiver who might be filling out the surveys. If it's a trial where the participant themselves can complete the survey, we see this placebo effect. And even the clinicians who are doing the clinician reported outcomes sometimes may report benefits. So that is why it's important when you're in a clinical trial to really be as objective as possible. And that is why you may have heard that the study sponsors hope that you don't share what you're seeing, because they don't want you to influence how other trial participants may view how their loved one does. So it's not that you're not allowed to, it's just, it would be a best practice if it wasn't shared. It doesn't mean that it doesn't, information doesn't get shared. We all live in a virtual world. There are many ways that people share what's going on, and being in a clinical trial is a big deal for individuals that are involved. And I understand why they want to share what they may be seeing or maybe not seeing, but just know that the best practice is to not share. All right, and I think I've answered all of those questions. I'm gonna just pause and give a few seconds if there's any other new questions that come in. But otherwise, I want to thank you for for your involvement, for listening in today, for wanting to get to know. You know what? Actually, we just got another question. Can families share how they are participating, i.e. making travel and time away from work? Absolutely. Those are the bits that are so helpful. That is where having your community, having your support network really helps to understand how did you make it work? How did you get to those trial sites? Maybe you don't have a clinic that's participating in the clinical trial that your child is eligible for that's nearby. You might have to fly. You might have to take long drives. You might have to stay overnight in a hotel. And so hearing from your community about what worked for them, what didn't work for them, is really the best way that we can help each other in this clinical trial journey. So we have another question on a family that lives abroad and where treatments and research about Rett is not really developed. Do you know how we can get in touch with a consult doctor in the US, even virtually? For international families, the best thing would be to first look what are the clinics that are closest to you. Travel can always be challenging, especially during this time of a pandemic, but there might be a clinic that's a shorter flight away than the US. As far as do US clinics do virtual visits with international patients, that really is something that the clinics each individually have to set up and manage because it has to be something that their hospital system allows them to do. So for right now, to be able to reach a clinic for virtual visits, it would be, you could contact individual clinics. On our website, we do have the listing of the clinics, both in the US, as well as we're updating our listing of international clinics. So there's a question, it says, so if young Rett girls are not good candidates for trials, what is a good age to participate? I always say the only consistent thing about Rett syndrome is the inconsistency. And so I'm gonna have some inconsistency in my answer here. It's not that a young child is not a good candidate. So it really depends on what the drug that you're testing, what the anticipated outcome is, what it is, what benefit you're trying to see. So is this a medication for specifically for seizures in a child with Rett syndrome? Is this supposed to be a more global improvement? Is this, someone brought up the Efficacy trial, is this a gene therapy? So all of these really have very different considerations. And so for the drugs that we currently have in clinical trials, they do not go for young children, and those are not the best trial participants based on the studies that these sponsors have designed. It's not to say that there couldn't be a trial in the future for a younger child with Rett syndrome. Just for the drugs that we have right now and the way that we have to test improvement and the way that we have to understand the stability of one with Rett syndrome, the young children are not included. And again, it looks like we have come to a pause in the questions. And so once again, I want to thank you all for tuning in, for listening, for asking these great questions. We're always here for you. We're always open to discussions. We want to hear from you to know what your concerns are so that we know how to best educate the community, answering the questions that you have rather than guessing what it is that you want to hear. So thank you all. Don't forget to tune in on July 15th to hear Dr. Alan Percy in a Rett Ed webinar. You can register through rettsyndrome.org for that webinar so that you get the email with the login information. And thank you very much. Have a great day.